Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this live interview today. My name is Leah, and I'm the managing editor of the Oxford Political Review, and I will be a co-interviewer alongside Simple Rajrah, our culture and ideas editor. Today, we are honoured to be joined by Professor Margaret MacMillan. Professor MacMillan is a Canadian historian and professor of history at the University of Oxford, formerly warden at St Antony's College. She is the author of 12 books on history and international relations, most notably her 2001 title, Peacemakers, which concerned the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Her work has also covered other areas such as the British Empire in India, Canada and its relationship with NATO, and history's leading personalities and figures. But she has now returned to the theme of war in her most recent title, published at the end of last year, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. She also gave the 2018 Reith Lectures, a series of lectures organised by the BBC, arguably the most prestigious series of public lectures. Former speakers include Bertrand Russell, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Aung San Suu Kyi, and Hilary Mantel. The theme of Professor MacMillan's lectures was War, under the title The Mark of Cain. Professor MacMillan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Starting, Professor MacMillan, if we can, with the theme of war, given that it's your current work, why is it so essential that in 2021, where relatively speaking, looking at history as a whole, we now enjoy a preponderance of peace, that we study war? How does understanding war assist us today?
I think there are two reasons, really, Nicholas. One is that war has been a very important force in shaping our societies, shaping our institutions, shaping our values. And if you think of the impact of war in the past, how winning or losing a war, or victory or loss in a war, might have made a real difference to the course of history. I mean, if the Ottoman Empire had managed to expand successfully into the heart of Europe, we might see a very different Central Europe today, and with different cultural values and perhaps a different outlook. And so I think war has often played a very important part in determining the course of human affairs, but it's also played a very important part in shaping our societies. You know, the relationship between the organization of society, including, of course, the growth of strong central government, has been intimately tied up with war. Our arts have been affected by war. Even the place names that surround us have often been affected by war. I mean, if you go to London, you might go into Waterloo Station. Or if you go to Paris, you might go to the Gare d'Austerlitz. So I think to know the impact of war, and in fact to understand our own societies, I think is important for us if we want to know more about ourselves. But I think to study war is also important because it hasn't disappeared from the face of the earth. And a number of us have been very lucky. I'm Canadian. I have lived through what a lot of people call the long peace since 1945, but it hasn't been a long peace for everyone. And if you think of how many wars there have been since 1945, somewhere or other in the world. I mean, it's easy if you live in North America or the UK to say war is something that happens somewhere else. It happens to other peoples. We don't do that sort of thing anymore. But that we know that's not true. And even relatively peaceful countries like the United States have engaged in overseas wars, and Britain at the moment, of course, is engaged in Afghanistan, as is the United States. And millions of people have died since 1945 because of war, and millions more have become refugees. And so I think we fool ourselves, into a dangerous sort of complacency if we think that war is vanishing. I don't think it is. And I think at the moment there is, I'm not saying a present danger, but I think there is more and more possibility of wars. We thought, I think, mistakenly in the 1990s and 2000s and even more recently, that wars would be managed, that they would occur mainly in failed states, civil wars and so on. But I think we now face a real prospect of state-to-state war. So yes, I think we need to consider war, not necessarily because we admire it or we are fascinated by it, but simply because it is such an important force, both in the past and the present.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Just following up on that, just thinking about the definition, you define war as organized, purposeful violence between, say, two political units. And that is certainly in tune with your understanding and suggestion to take war as a continuum rather than some sort of, historical aberration. But such a definition could mean different things depending on how one defines that violence and the scope of that devastation. Perhaps neocolonialism, for that matter, which is very much organized and very much purposeful between two units, could also be interpreted as war. So I'm wondering, and would that mean that war hasn't, disappeared, but simply changed shape? And can we then define neocolonial violence as also an act of war, or would that be, just going too far with it?
Well, it's always tricky with definitions, and there's never a very clear cutoff point. I mean, I took a rather narrow definition. As you said, war is organized violence. Therefore, the sort of fights that people might have at a football match because they support different sides, or the sort of violence outside a pub, is not, to me, war. It may have certain warlike aspects, and the employment of violence is a part of war. The threat of violence is a part of war. The use of violence against your enemies and to defend yourself is a part of war. But I see it as something organized, and organized by groups that have some political organization, some coherence, maybe shared values. And so I tend to resist, I may be wrong, but I tend to resist the expansion of the language of war into things that don't have that element of organization and violence. But in neocolonialism, I think you could argue that when violence is employed by an organized force against another, perhaps less organized force, it is a type of war. And so I would argue, for example, that what the Chinese have done in Tibet has been a war. And you could argue, although I think it's so one-sided that perhaps it's not a war, what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur is a form of war. But war tends to involve two adversaries. And so far, the Uyghur have not yet been able to mobilize themselves to fight back. I mean, I resist the expansion, I think, of the language. And we talk about wars on poverty, we talk about wars on violence, we talk about wars on all sorts of things. But I tend to resist that because I think to consider war as a phenomenon, it is quite useful to be able to focus on those aspects of violence and organization. I think it's the same reason, but I can understand why it happens, that I resist the expansion of the term genocide. It was coined very much in the wake of what had happened to the Jews in particular after 1945, and it's a very careful definition. And so if we expand the meaning of genocide to cover all sorts of other things, do we lose sight of that core of the original meaning? I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer, but anyway, this is the road I've chosen to take.
Thank you. That explains much. And just following up on that, we're thinking, since we're already on the topic of definitions, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that a lot of leading newspapers and journalists have described, including New York Times, Guardian, Al Jazeera, for that matter, have described the war on the pandemic. Yeah. Do you think that this is an appropriate usage, or in fact, should the COVID-19 situation be likened to war, or the responses to it be likened to war? Just wondering what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, I think there's a difference between warlike features, because war has a number of features, including its organization, including the mobilization often of propaganda, including the definition of an enemy. But I don't think the fact that other types of political upheavals or projects contain some of those features make it war. I mean, I find the notion of war on a virus absurd. You can't find the enemy, you can't see the enemy. How do you know when the enemy has agreed to surrender? It's a bit like the war on terror. I've always thought it's absurd, because how do you make war on a noun? And it seems to me to be empty of meaning. It's a useful metaphor, but I think it can go too far. But of course, a lot of statesmen loved it. I mean, President Trump initially, when he had a brief moment of taking the pandemic seriously, declared himself a war president. I find this sort of rhetoric really rather empty and doesn't really tell you very much about what needs to be done.
Professor MacMillan, building on this theme slightly, we're talking about propaganda here, and whether it is war or a pandemic, as today, governments do seek compliance generally from the civic population during such crises. And I think it's fair to say that crises are great tests of our institutions, our public finances, and our national resolve. And I wonder if you think that this is a watershed moment for many of us, particularly younger generations, who have not necessarily experienced the horrors of war or the mass loss of life before, as it so impinged on previous generations. And how do you think our institutions will look once we emerge from this current crisis?
It's a very important issue, I think, for all of us. And I think just as a war, particularly a major war, makes you rely on others in your society. Societies that manage to work together tend to survive wars better than those that fall to pieces. We know what happens when societies aren't able, for various reasons, to cope with the pressures of great challenges like war. And so I think what the pandemic has done has made us recognize that we are part of a series of communities and that what binds us is very important. And I think what it's also done, and indeed a war can do this, is make us more aware of things that are wrong in our societies. You know, I think there was a lot of discussion before the pandemic hit about growing inequality, for example, about the growing concentration of wealth in a very few hands in a number of countries, such as Britain and the United States. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted some of those issues. And it's been clear that countries that have dealt most successfully with the pandemic have been countries with both, I think, leadership that is responsible and capable and often effective bureaucracies, but also a fair degree of social cohesion, that people are prepared to work together. They understand why they need to wear masks, for example, that wearing of a mask is not something, as a number of people in the United States seem to believe, that impinges on your liberty. Wearing of a mask is showing a responsibility to others whom you might infect with the disease as much as it is about protecting yourself. And so, yes, I think these great crises often help to shine a spotlight on what may be weak points of our societies, what may need to be improved, and also pushes us and pushes governments into doing things that they wouldn't have thought of doing before. You know, we're now about a year, I think, into the lockdown in the UK when everyone began to take the pandemic seriously. It was happening around the world, of course. And if you had said to anyone a year ago, February, by the way, the government is going to be spending vast amounts to support the unemployed, it's going to help people out of work, it's going to prop up companies, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to stay home, the government is going to restrict what you can do, it's going to restrict your movements, we all would have said that's nuts. We don't live in a dictatorial society. We don't live in an authoritarian society. And yet, look where we are today. And you know, the whole notion, which was so prevalent among thinking in governments and civil servants and politicians, of austerity, of balancing budgets, we're not hearing much about that anymore. And so often a great crisis will push us both into recognizing what needs to be fixed or changed, but also to doing things we would have thought impossible. And it's not just pandemics, of course. War will do that. Great economic crises will do that. The Great Depression pushed governments into doing the sorts of things they might not have done before. And so we don't wish that change would come about in this way, but sometimes beneficial change can come out of such crises. I mean, I tend to think that we may well be looking at our society, we may well be finding ways of making them stronger as we move out of the pandemic.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor, for that. And while we're speaking of, responses that governments are, sometimes they are creative and they surprise us with these forms of responses. We're also thinking that in recent years, with the rise of populism and populist rhetoric, whether it's the right-wing Hindu groups from India, or it is the United States, as we were speaking, or even in Britain, quite often these groups have evoked military imagery, by employing terms like a people's army, or insinuating that we're at the peak of a crisis and something needs to be done urgently. Now, I'm thinking, what does this mean for the prospect of real conflict, and what does history teach us in this respect, given that you've been studying war, and both your books have been dealing with that quite fervently?
Well, I think a crisis is what you make of it, or what your leaders make of it. And I think that is something that we've seen. We've seen populist leaders in several parts of the world using the crisis as a way of mobilizing opinion against the other or against outsiders. For example, in India, as you probably know, there has been an attempt made by certain BJP politicians to say that somehow the virus started in Muslim neighborhoods and that Muslims are somehow to blame. And that, of course, is part of a longer the tradition within the BJP of singling out others. You've had in Hungary, the populist government of Viktor Orban blaming or trying to blame the pandemic on refugees and saying, that the virus, as much as refugees, is an alien thing in the Hungarian nation. And so that, I think, is very dangerous. What we've also seen, I think, is in responses to the pandemic, a worsening of relations between certain countries. I'm thinking of the United States and China, as politicians on each side and others have tried to blame the other. The fact that President Trump and his administration called it the Wuhan virus, I think, was an attempt to put the blame on China. And in China, there were these rumors that somehow the CIA had been responsible for it. Now, that's not going to create conflict between China and the United States or between Hungary and its neighbors, or it's not going to create conflict within India between Hindus and Muslims, but it will add to increasing tensions, and it will become part of a narrative that those people over there always do this sort of thing to us. So yes, I think that response has been dangerous, and its use by populist leaders has been very worrying.
Building a little bit on this question of populism, like many people in Europe were seduced in the 20th century into war on behalf of the nation, a very abstract concept in some ways that you've obviously explored in depth in your works. Could it be said that many around the world today are being seduced by populism as a consequence of globalization, in the sense that they feel disoriented, no longer understand the way the world works for them, or perhaps they don't think the world works for them? And what do you think is the interplay between populism and globalization today?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a connection, and I think we saw it as well in history before 1914, which was the other great age of globalization. And when you got similar reactions in Europe, for example, people blaming immigrants, or in places like Vienna, blaming the Jews for jobs disappearing, technology often taking jobs away. Mass production meant that shoemakers and tailors were no longer needed as much as they once had been. And there is always, I think, a tendency to find someone or something to blame for our present troubles. I mean, that's a very natural and often repeated human tendency. And there are those who will use it. Now, I think I would make a distinction, and I think the globalization of today has produced a sense among a great many people that the world is changing too fast. They have less and less place in it. They have less and less hope that their children are going to be able to get jobs and lead a satisfying life. And I think that is a very understandable reaction. And I think it reflects something, of course, very real. The difference, I think, the crucial question is in how you deal with it. And I would make a real distinction between the populist leaders. I mean, I define populist leaders very much on the lines of those who blame others, those who want to create others, those who want to create the circle and then define others as being outside it, and who are often anti-democratic, who will use democratic methods to get into power and then simply destroy them or exploit them, as again, I think we see in countries like Hungary, and we're seeing, I'm afraid, a bit in Spain today. So I think that's what I mean by populism. But I think there's also another reaction which bears many of the same features as populism, and that reaction is a radical politics, which will still work within democratic structures, but wants to bring about real significant change. And I think both the radical politics, which are trying to bring about change, and the populist politics, which clearly overlap, reflect something real. I mean, they're not creating something out of nothing. They reflect very real problems with globalization. Globalization has not benefited a lot of people. In fact, it's hurt a lot of people. And while a lot of people, middle classes, upper classes, have done well out of it, there are a lot of people who haven't done. And the middle class, I think, is increasingly getting squeezed. And so the reaction to globalization is, I think, a reasonable one in many cases, but it's the forms it takes that can either actually begin to make things better or in my view, make things worse.
It's very interesting. And turning to one of the key themes of your Reith lectures, which was, I suppose, the relationship between war and nation states, and its institutions. And we can certainly see that in the case of, say, the United States, there has often been a concerted effort to frame itself in contradistinction to cultural others, or indeed others, during the 20th century, whether that be fascist Europe or the Soviet Union later, and perhaps now today, China. And I'm particularly interested in that last question. There have been trade wars, obviously, between the US and China, but do you view US-China contradistinction as a potential pathway to a real conflict? And what does history teach us here?
I think there is real potential. I think both nationalism the dangers of nationalism, and we don't have quite the right words in English for it, but I think George Orwell made the distinction between the sort of patriotism he felt towards England. He said, I feel perfectly entitled to criticize it. I think there's a lot wrong with it, but I don't think it's such a bad place. And the nationalism, which says my nation is the best, and I won't accept criticisms of it. And it's that sort of nationalism which I think we're seeing a lot of today. And I think that is very unfortunate. What I think also makes things difficult between the United States and China is I think both see themselves as models for the world. Both see themselves in a sense as a civilization whose values are the values that others should want. And then they have very real issues between them. You know, they are deeply linked economically, but that, as we know, does not necessarily mean countries have to like each other. Germany and Britain were each other's greatest trading partners before the First World War, and look how that ended up. And so close economic linkages doesn't necessarily make you get on better with each other. And I think there are real strategic issues between them. China is increasingly aggressive in its own neighborhood, and it's, of course, trying to expand its influence elsewhere. But think of the neighborhood of China, and particularly at sea and around its borders. You know, the Chinese have become increasingly aggressive in their patrols in the East China and South China Seas. They're building up a very big navy. And the US has major strategic interests in the Pacific. And so there are a number of things that could make the relationship between them get a lot worse. Everything from different values, different views of the world, to economic issues, and then, of course, to these strategic issues. And what concerns me now is that both sides seem to be talking more and more as if a conflict's going to come or is very likely. And I've always felt, and I may be wrong, but I've always felt that that's a crucial psychological barrier. In the First World War, when they began thinking we probably can't avoid a war, then I think it became that much more likely, because when you give up trying to avoid something, you start planning and preparing for it. And both in Beijing and Washington, you are getting those in the military, those in think tanks, those in government circles, those in the press, talking about the possibility of a war between China and the United States. They're still saying if, but increasingly it's becoming when. And that worries me, because it seems to me to have almost a predictive value.
Interesting, Professor. Just moving on to a slightly different aspect of your work, slightly previous work, I was wondering if we could speak a bit about the Women of the Raj text. One of your first books was on Women of the Raj, which is the women who came along with their partners, who were then British officers at that point ruling India. Now, these were women who I think were trying very hard to simultaneously maintain their traditional, their role as a traditional housewife, while also, facing significant difficulties in adjusting to a new world. In many ways, these were women who were wives of colonizers, who were to interact very closely as Mem Sahibs with the Indian women who entered their homes and supported their domestic chores. In what ways does studying them aid our understanding of colonization, and especially their complicity in it?
When I started out doing I did a thesis on the British in India. And so the Women of the Raj was really grew out of that, and I did more research for it. But when I started out, I had a particular view of the Raj. I felt it was probably peopled by those who had very little understanding of India, who expressed attitudes which I found abhorrent. But I began to think that the problems of these relationships, those in control, are in a way themselves in a trap. They are pushed to behave in certain ways. This is not to say I'm exonerating them or excusing them, but I think I began to understand just how difficult it can be to be part of a small group. And when you are under pressure to maintain your membership of that group, there was nowhere much for the women. Perhaps for the men it was easier. Some men did leave, they did get jobs in businesses, some stayed on in India, some left. But for the women, there was a vast majority of British women in India were there as wives. There were some who were there as missionaries, some who were there as medical people, some who went out to teach, but the vast majority were wives. And where could they go? If they decided they didn't like living in India, if they decided they didn't like being married, this was not really much of a choice they had in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some did. Some left, some went back to Britain. But, life as a divorced woman without any means of support could be very difficult. And so I think I gained a sympathy, and I gained a sense of just how difficult it is for groups to meet each other, especially when they can't meet as equals. Later on, there would be attempts. Lady Reading, who's the wife of the Viceroy after the First World War, set up Purdah clubs so that women could meet, British women and Indian women could meet. And they were usually, real friendships did develop, but I think that these were often very awkward affairs. And there was a very funny program the BBC did years ago, a radio program called Indian Views of the Raj, or Indian Tales of the Raj. And they interviewed Indian women who'd been part of these gatherings. And they were quite funny about it. They said, the English women looked so odd. And they wore these terrible corsets, and they wore these peculiar things on their heads, and they just looked sort of hot and uncomfortable. It was very, and we didn't really know what to talk to them about because they didn't know much about our history or our culture. Having said that, there were always people who managed to break beyond that and establish relationships. But it was quite interesting to get the voices of the Indians as they looked at these attempts to reach across the divides. But I think it's always, and I reflected when I brought out a later edition of the book and I wrote a new introduction, I reflected, that there's something in that experience, possibly for us today, that how do groups with different values meet and respect each other on a basis of equality?
Thank you. And that is why, Professor, your work becomes, it's even more important because it helps us analyze that once you look at the intricacies in which life is actually felt under, even under oppression, that gives you so much, because even people, like you said, who were on the different side of the spectrum were also trapped, with the burdens of it. They also had to deal with the burdens of colonization, the way that these women who were transferred to different cities and still had to make traditional roles. And that brings me to our next question, which is related to your work on, much of your work has been a detailed analysis of personalities, of people, their intimate lives. It could be, like we spoke about, women of the Raj, or it could be Nixon, it could be Mao Zedong. While this revelation of their affective complexities is really useful, what do you find to be the principal strengths of a biographical and microhistorical approach, especially, emerging fields like auto theory, for that matter?
Yeah. Well, it's always been my preference, I think. There's always a balance in history, I think, between the individuals in the past, especially if you're looking at the things I've tended to look at, which is momentous decisions. Then you really do need to know something about those who are making them and what their set of values is. There's always a tension between that and the context within which they live, the institutions, the values, the ways in which they look at the world. And I think we need to do both. My own preference has always been to try and bring a personal element in. I think I'm just interested in it. I've always been interested in, when I first became interested in history, I was interested in the details of life. What was it like then? What would I have eaten? What would I have worn? When I was a child, there was a very nice series of children's books, sort of what was life like for a little Roman, or what was life like for a little Egyptian. And I think that helped to stimulate my curiosity. But I think when I looked at people in the past, I thought as much as possible, we need to understand what it is that shapes them and what their perceptions of themselves and their world are. And there's really interesting work being done in history now on the history of emotions and how emotions play into decision making, but also how emotions simply affect the ways in which societies see themselves. I'm very struck. I don't know if you watched the famous or infamous interview with Harry and Meghan, but I was very struck by how increasingly people use the language of therapy. They talk about their feelings, they talk about their management of their feelings, they talk about what has happened to them in ways that I think a previous generation wouldn't have done. But I think that's partly, when we look at history, we're trying to think, what do people in the past feel about things? What was it like? I became very interested when I was writing my book on the outbreak of the First World War on what men were brought up to be like. Were they expected to be ready to go to war? And how did they see themselves? What pressures were on them to conform to some sort of ideal, and also what pressures were on women at the time. So I do think, for myself, we all have our own ways of doing history, but I am very interested in the peoples of the past and also the individuals of the past.
taking a slight turn and focusing on more the causes or potentially the effects of war. And I've long been interested in your work on the Paris Peace Conference, and of course your title Peacemakers. And that was a staple read of mine before I began my interest in becoming a university student, as a history student. So I wanted to ask you, while I've got the opportunity, in that book you argued very passionately that a Wilsonian peace would not have been acceptable to Germany. Perhaps it lacked what A.G.B. Taylor would have called a moral validity, and really that it was unlikely that Germany would accept any settlement predicated on her defeat. But I was wondering if you thought, with any hindsight or any further reflection later in your career, that if the US had not retreated into isolationism in the 1920s and 30s, that there was a chance some settlement could work, or was it just that Germany needed to be the enforcer and it never had prospect of success?
Actually, I've more and more come to think, and more work has come out, not my work, but more work by others has come out on the 1920s, which I now find particularly interesting, because for so long we thought the 1920s were just this little short gap when people danced the Charleston and drank bathtub gin, and then the 1930s comes and Europe slides towards war. And I think that was wrong. The 20s were not just a prelude. The 20s, we don't always look at decades, but the 1920s, I think, are bookmarked very much as a decade by the end of the First World War and then the Great Depression at the end of them. And I think the more we look at the 1920s, the more we can see there was an alternative path for Europe and there was an alternative path for Germany. The Weimar Republic was established in the aftermath of war. It was not widely popular in certain circles in Germany, but it was establishing itself. And I think given time, it might have become something different. The republic that was established in Germany after the Second World War wasn't particularly popular, but over time it became something that simply became part of Germany and German life. And I think that prospect was there. And there was a normalization of Germany's relations with other countries. Germany did join the League of Nations in the mid-1920s. It did sign the Locarno agreements. It did get its finances under control. Reparations, which were a very sore point, were in fact negotiated down twice, and I think were less of a burden than many of the far right were likely to claim. And so I think we could have imagined, we'll never know, alternative history doesn't work, but it is possible to imagine a Germany where Weimar becomes more and more accepted, the generations pass, the old guard disappears, they were getting on, where Weimar is accepted, where Germany becomes a peaceful nation, as the Germany of today is. And yet what happened, of course, is it didn't go that route. And I think really my own sense, and there's a lot of debate about this, my own sense, if it had not been for the Great Depression, things might have turned out very differently. That the Depression pushed a number of countries into crisis, and Germany was very hard hit by the Depression. And it fostered a growth of radical non-democratic parties on both the right and the left, which weakened democracy. And of course, I think if you actually look at how Hitler got into power, there have been a couple of very good books on this recently. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. He was invited in by, in my view, dangerously blind and self-seeking members of the elites. They needn't have invited him in, but they did because they thought they could use him, rather like the Republican Party in the US thought they could use Trump. And we've seen how well that turned out, and or how badly that turned out. And so I do think it is possible. The United States wasn't, I think, particularly the 20s, as isolationist as I had once thought. It didn't join the League, but it continued to have observers at the League. It continued to be engaged in a number of issues in Europe. And it was Americans who helped to negotiate and renegotiate the whittling down of the reparations bill that Germany had. And Washington often took the lead in disarmament conferences, for example. And so, I think the United States was playing a role, perhaps not as dramatic as certainly not as dramatic as it played after the Second World War, but it wasn't completely absent.
Thank you. A very interesting take, Professor. On a general subject of historicism, I wanted to ask, what do you make of historicism and the use of meta-narratives in historical writing, especially on, subjects like, or like historical themes like that of war?
So you mean looking back at history with the lens of the present? Or, sorry.
Yes, I mean, could be that, but also like, forming meta-narratives and grand theories in certain subjects with that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think people always do form grand narratives, but I hope it's usually not historians, although historians can contribute to that, as they did in the 19th century. I am suspicious, I think, of grand narratives because of what they leave out or what they choose to include. They can, of course, be enormously powerful. And in some cases, that power, I think, is not a good thing. I mean, the grand narrative that the Leave campaign used during the pre-running in the run-up to the referendum was a very effective one. It was of a Britain that had always fought alone. It was of a Britain that could go its own way. It was of a global Britain. It was a Britain that was taking something back that it had lost. Now, no, that's not an accurate picture of the past. And as a Canadian, when I heard, and I did have a number of arguments with people, when they said we fought alone in 1940 after the fall of France, and I said, there was something called the British Empire. You know, a quarter of all your pilots in Bomber Command were Canadian. There were a lot of Polish pilots. There were a lot of Australians fighting for you. There were millions, hundreds of thousands of Indians fighting for you. So, this talk of we fought alone and we don't need anyone else was completely misleading. So, yes, I am suspicious of grand narratives very much. And I think anything that tries to impose a single view of the past, whenever I hear that governments want to get involved with curriculum, I worry. Because governments tend to come in with, ham fists and they don't really know half the time what they're talking about. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think it does, and it builds on something we wanted to ask next, which is really about the role of historians in public life. And we're talking now about grand narratives being used as propaganda tools to fuel campaigns, political campaigns. And in your book, The Uses and Abuses of History, you do criticize not only historians for often talking to each other and not the public, but also these political leaders for using history for their own ends. I was just interested if you think to counter those problems, historians themselves ought to be more political or engaging more in the public sphere in channeling the debate.
It depends how we engage. Too often, I think, and you can see it certainly in the 19th century, and we can see it in the 20th century, historians became part of a nationalist project, and they created highly nationalist histories. You think of the histories that were created in a number of European countries in the 19th century. In Germany, you had German historians arguing there had always been something called a German people, which was false history and bad history, but it became very powerful. So I think when historians do that, it is not a good thing. I think where we can be useful, and I think we ought to try and be useful, is that we can raise issues and we can perhaps provide context. We can say to governments, well, if you do this, let me just remind you that when a previous government tried to do the same thing, they ran into trouble. And so, the example I often give is when the British and Americans were thinking of going into Iraq in what became the invasion and occupation, they should have asked more than they did historians, what happened the last time the British went into Iraq at the end of the First World War? How did the Iraqis respond to that? Was it all easy? The trouble was they didn't ask those questions at the time, and then they found themselves confronting them later. And I think historians can do that. I think we can raise possibilities. We can provide context. We can suggest questions. I see ourselves as sort of, those irritating people who say that's all very well, but have you thought of the following? We add another dimension. And so I think, you said also, do we talk too much to ourselves? I think there is a danger. History has become a profession, and it's very much centered in the universities, although there are, of course, a lot of historians who work outside universities. But I think particularly in the universities, there's an attempt to follow the example of political science, which itself has followed the example of economics, which itself has followed the example of science, to become more objective, more facts-based, all of which is good, but we are not a science. And I don't think we should take refuge in talking in highly abstract or highly technical terms. Too many of the historical journals I look at are written in ways which, even as an historian, I find difficult to read. But anyone who just is interested in history may find themselves absolutely unwilling to try and go through some of this stuff. And I think that's a shame. I think we do have something to offer. And I think historians bring a very useful perspective. I mean, I wish in a way that we were consulted more. I thought one of the weaknesses in the British government's response to the COVID pandemic was it tended to concentrate very much on consulting epidemiologists. It didn't consult enough engineers, and a number of engineers have complained about this. It didn't consult economists enough. It rarely consulted, I don't think they consulted historians at all. And they didn't consult sociologists and anthropologists enough. You know, I think when you face a crisis, you need to bring in a number of perspectives if you want to get good advice.
That, Professor, that links up to our final question on this. Looking back at your career in academia, you've taught at various institutions, including, of course, Oxford and then University of Toronto. But for the first 25 years or so, you were at Ryerson University, also in Toronto, which is known to focus more on vocational courses and, technological courses as well. How did that experience of teaching history to engineers, entrepreneurs, or nurses, journalists, shape the sort of historian that you've become?
I think it was crucial because it made me tell a story and I had to interest them. You know, I would prepare a very careful lecture on Marx's thought and I'd see their eyes sort of slightly glaze over. But I found if I told them what it was like, if I said, if you've ever read Dickens, this is what it was like for children. I said, you wouldn't be sitting here in this classroom. You would have been out working since you were 14 years of age. Your mother might well have died in childbirth. You would be hungry a lot of the time. You probably couldn't read and write because that would be true of an awful lot of people in that age. And that's what you need to understand about why you got revolutionary solutions to what was happening as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And I found if I could tell them those stories and if I could tell them what had happened, just describing the rise of fascism initially, if I could tell them a bit about Mussolini, it would help them, I think, to understand that these were events involving real people. And so, in fact, I dedicated one of my books to my students because I think they oblige me to try and learn how to get through to them and make what I was saying interesting. I mean, I don't think I dumbed it down, but I think I simply tried to develop techniques that would make it possible for them to get interested. I think my greatest compliment I ever got from a student at Ryerson was a really nice student who was in something called environmental health. And they did things like looking at sewers and looking at water supplies and so on, very important job. And he said, I liked your lecture on Napoleon today. And he said, it was really a lot better than the one I had this morning on polluted sludge. So, I thought that's a compliment. And, it is very satisfying, as I'm sure you will find in your lives, when you explain something to someone, they say, I hadn't thought of that. And isn't that interesting? It's a great sense of achievement.
Thank you so much, Professor. We've really learned so much from our conversation today. I think this is a suitable place to draw the interview to a close. We've covered a lot of areas. Professor MacMillan, we're extremely grateful for your presence and your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. You had very good questions, not all of which I could answer, which is a mark of how good they were. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor.